Welcome to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I'm the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine. I am joined today by Naomi Oreskes. She is a professor of the history of science at Harvard University. And I am also joined by Erik M. Conway. He's a historian at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory at the California Institute of Technology. They are the authors of, first, the best-selling book, Merchants of Doubt, how a handful of scientists obscured the truth on issues from tobacco smoke to global warming, but most recently, The Big Myth, how American business taught us to loathe government and love the free market. So thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
So let's start with, what's the big myth?
The big myth is what Ronald Reagan called the magic of the marketplace. It's the idea that, first of all, there even is such a thing as the free market, the idea that markets somehow stand apart from society and governance. It's the idea that the market has wisdom, that it's efficient, that it's intelligent, that it has almost godlike powers. And so therefore we should have faith in the wisdom of the marketplace or the invisible hand. And also, and crucially, the argument that was made in the 20th century that capitalism and freedom are indivisible, that they go hand in hand. And therefore, if you compromise economic freedom, if you encourage government action in the marketplace, you're threatening political and social freedom. So those three components together we call the big myth.
And it's an extremely powerful, and to give it its credit, to give it its due, it's a quite persuasive myth in some ways, because it has an answer for everything. When there's a problem, it's a problem of government, and the solution would be less of it. I have spent a lot of my time reading and debunking right-wing arguments, but I give them some credit in that it's a good story, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, it's a great story, but while we find it persuasive in the present, it's persuasive because we've been immersed in that propaganda for our entire lives. The New Deal generation of Americans didn't find it very persuasive at all because they had watched the failure of capitalism and lived through the troubling times of near starvation and Hoovervilles and so forth. And so they weren't nearly so prepared to buy the myth of the market. So that's one of the reasons we spend a good bit of time on the troubles of the alleged free markets back in the 30s.
Right, because we've had a number of dissident economists on the program who have criticized the empirical foundations of this myth. But I wanted to ask you what you think historians bring to this conversation, because we haven't yet talked to people who are historians and excavating where these ideas came from.
Well, I think it's exactly what you said. What we've done in this book is to excavate where these ideas have come from and how they were made to stick, how they were made persuasive. Because as Erik just said, and as you just said, Nathan, if you look at the empirical evidence, it does not support the idea that markets are magical, that they're full of wisdom, and that you can just, quote, leave them alone and let them do their magic. The evidence does not remotely support that hypothesis. So the answer is, why would anyone believe it? And so part of what we've done in this book is to excavate this history to show, well, where did these ideas come from in the first place? Who was it that was promoting these ideas? And how did they try to make it persuasive? And so a key part of the argument of the book is that part of the answer to that question is saturation. So in the book, we show how these business conservatives who are at the heart of the story saturated the American public by paying people to rewrite textbooks, developing radio programs, advertising campaigns, newsletters and magazines targeted at young Americans, materials targeted at school teachers, at ministers, an incredible panoply of activities so that Americans would be bombarded by this message that markets were efficient and that government was not just inefficient, but a threat to your personal freedom.
Where can you trace back this idea of market fundamentalism to? Because I know that a lot of the people who endorse it will claim that they are merely applying the economics of Adam Smith. But of course, as you point out, this requires a great deal of misrepresentation of the actual beliefs of Adam Smith. So what are the origins of this kind of radical market fundamentalism?
Well, we locate it much more recently than poor old Adam Smith. And we start with arguments over child labor and over workmen's compensation. And the reason is because that's when we begin to see these arguments against state intervention in business affairs really start to get deployed and promoted and polished to a, kind of a nice sharp point. We talk about an accident crisis, not just in the United States, but throughout Europe as industrialization and mechanization take over and that harm, maim, kill millions of people. And the US finally finds its ideas of reform in Europe in order to begin overcoming it. But then the activists have to fight all the business people proclaiming the need for freedom.
So, to what extent does this originate with industry, with corporations trying to avoid having to spend more money on keeping workers safe? Does it have any origins in academic economics, or does its infiltration into economics come later?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in the book, we answer it. So the answer is both. Yes, both end. So in the book, we show, as Erik just said, how the beginnings of this argument can be recognized in the early 20th century in America as people begin to raise questions about what we refer to as the social costs of capitalism. Children working in factories and textile mills, millions of workers being hurt or injured on the job, sometimes catastrophically so, and leaving their families with nothing. So an argument begins to be developed where reformers say the government has to play a role here. The government has to be engaged. And we don't like to use the word intervention because we think that reinforces the false dichotomy that markets are over here.
Pristine markets,
Right. There's no such thing as a free market. Markets have always had rules and regulations going back to the Bible. So there's a question about what is the appropriate role of government to protect children from labor or to protect workers from injury. And so a lot of public support begins to develop in the 10s, 20s, and 30s for government action to protect children, to protect the injured worker, to protect the unemployed, particularly after the crash of 29. But the business community is ready with their answer. And their answer is no, you cannot let the government do this because if they do, your freedom will be threatened. But in the meantime, well, I don't want to say exactly independently because one of the questions we're not 100% able to answer is how independent these two strands are. But I think there's good evidence that they start out independent. In Europe, there is an academic argument being developed in Vienna, and it's what's known in hindsight as Austrian economics, sometimes referred to as neoliberalism. So you have a group of people around Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich von Hayek, and some other Austrians who are independently making an argument against Soviet-style centralized planning. And they argue, and I think not ridiculously, I think there's a germ of important insight here, that there is a connection between communism, Soviet-style communism with central planning, 5-year plans, and the denial of freedom. Because for a government to plan the economy, the government has to take control of a lot of things, including where you work, what job you have, how much your factory produces. And so they argue that any form of centralized planning has necessarily will end up totalitarian, even if it doesn't start that way. And so this argument gains a certain amount of traction in Europe because there is a certain logic to it. The illogic, in our opinion, is that then von Mises, and to some extent, although not as much as many people think, Hayek begin to argue that therefore this is why you should not have government engagement in these questions about the social costs of capitalism, because it's a slippery slope and you will end up in a totalitarian dictatorship. We have pretty good evidence that these two strands are developing more or less independently through the 1920s and 30s, but at some point they connect. And they connect in the person of Ludwig von Mises, who begins working as a consultant to the National Association of Manufacturers, who are the key business group in the United States pushing these arguments. And then from there, they get closer and closer. So these business people bring von Hayek to America. And in the book, then we show how these business conservatives actively engage to promote Austrian-style neoliberalism in an American version in America.
Now, you say this is occurring throughout the 1920s and 30s. So presumably in the United States, they kind of, at least in the first battle, lose, right? Because if they're coming with a strong criticism of Marxism, socialism, as you say, the capitalism gets rather discredited over the course of the 1930s.
Yeah, it gets rather discredited over the course of the 1930s, but that doesn't stop them. And in the United States, the National Association of Manufacturers begins to forge its Tripod of Freedom campaign, which is specifically intended to begin reversing this slide towards New Dealism, what they saw as some sort of radical socialism. And their tripod was essentially the goal of it was to link business freedom, economic freedom, and give it the same resonance in American freedoms as freedom of religion and political freedom, freedom of speech. Those are the three legs of the tripod of freedom, according to NAM, and they begin mass advertising campaign. Now, during World War II, of course, that all kind of comes to an end for a while. But one of the things they learn is how powerful propaganda can be. The Roosevelt administration had an enormous propaganda effort during the war. It took control of the media and used it to promote the war. And in business, people were part of that. There's an advertising council that's formed to help the administration get the message out. And after the war, the business community realizes that, they can keep this ad council around and promote capitalism that way. And then businesses can promote not just individual products, but the whole idea of market capitalism. And we go into that a little bit, and then the foundation of think tanks to also begin promoting it a little bit more independently of the manufacturers associations. So it becomes an effort to reverse the New Deal at a level of advertising.
That concept of economic freedom, again, to sort of pay tribute to the cleverness of some of these propagandists. I'm always impressed by the way that the freedom of corporations to stomp on people and do whatever they please is packaged as a form of freedom that everyone should endorse.
Yeah, and if I could just jump in here, I mean, one of the things we show, some of the documents we found, the business community realizes that the argument they're making is self-serving, right? They're trying to protect the prerogatives of business owners at the same time that they're heavily anti-union and arguing against the freedom of workers to form unions and other collective bargaining units. So they know that it's self-serving and potentially even could be accused of being hypocritical. So they say what we need to do here is to try to link the argument to something that all Americans cherish, something that all Americans hold dear, and that's freedom. And so it is extremely clever because they managed to repackage what is something that is clearly self-interested into something that can be sold to all of the American people.
Something I think about a lot, although I feel like it's not actually terribly relevant what the answer is the question, do people believe what they're actually arguing, right? And I don't know if when you look into the historical record, you find, kind of direct evidence that at various points there is sort of internal knowledge that evidence is being manipulated, that terms are being crafted, as you say, that you said that they know it's self-interested. But to what degree do you discover sort of evidence of outright dishonesty?
We get asked this question all the time. And of course, it's very challenging because we can never know for sure what's truly in people's hearts. But in this story, we found a lot of evidence that they understood that what they were doing was propaganda. I mean, first of all, as I just said, the memo we found where they specifically say we have to figure out some way to link this to something that all Americans care about, and that's freedom, right? So they know it's hypocritical and they know it's dishonest. Another thing we see is that in general, they make a point of referring to what they're doing as public relations, but there are places where they slip and they actually use the word propaganda. And they talk in the early stages of the NAM campaign, they talk about who they need to hire to help them figure this out. And it's Edward Bernays, whose famous 1928 book has the title Propaganda. So I think that in this case, even though people, of course, rationalize it, and of course, there may be places where it's linked to things that people authentically believe. So I think, for example, if you think about von Mises and von Hayek and what it would have been like to have been living in Europe in the 1930s, certainly the worry or the anxiety about the rise of Soviet totalitarianism is a real one, a legitimate one. And then during the Great Depression, this question of, well, okay, governments have become very, very active in trying to pull the economy out of this worldwide depression. But what's going to happen after we get out of the depression? What's going to happen after World War II? Will we still have this massive amount of government control of the economy? And that's not an illegitimate question. So I think we see a mixture here of people raising legitimate questions and having legitimate concerns about how far should the government go in this space. But then it gets mixed in with rationalization and outright propaganda.
So Hayek writes this book at towards the end of the war, The Road to Serfdom. That is I don't know if it's ever gone out of print, perennially popular in conservative circles and still promoted today by the likes of Glenn Beck et al. So one could take a view, of course, that Hayek is just an apologist for the rich, conjuring a fear-mongering myth that the welfare state is going to take us down the road to being Nazi Germany. But it seems like what you're saying there is that it could be that Hayek himself, while wrong about that, I think kind of clearly wrong, because Britain did introduce the welfare state and they didn't end up being on the road to being Nazi Germany, could have had sort of legitimate concerns. But there are all these other entities that then, seize this and promote it and, make The Road to Serfdom the book of the month book and all that sort of thing.
I mean, there's a simplification effort going on there with Hayek, because Hayek actually wasn't opposed to many forms of regulation, including aspects of the welfare state. He, like Adam Smith, thought there did need to be better protections for labor. So he wasn't the extremists that we get from the likes of Glenn Beck and so forth. But what our actors do is they take Hayek and they simplify it down to a set of cartoons that we talk about in the book that are then put into Look magazine, for example, so everyone can see this extremely oversimplified edition of Hayek that starts with decent labor protection and ends in a firing squad and what is it, 20 frames, something small like that.
18, right?
Yeah. So there's a simplification of Hayek. So we're trying to be careful and not hang all this on Hayek, because it's that simplification process that turns him into propaganda.
Right. And Hayek there's this great line in The Road to Serfdom where he's not talking about laissez-faire. And he even says you have to stop talking about, government intervening. Of course you intervene. The question is where you draw the line. And I think that it's really good to remember that, because he's not wrong to ask that question. But what's wrong is the way it gets used and abused by business propagandists.
Something that must be a difficult task for historians like yourselves is figuring out cause and effect. But obviously you could get documents where organizations like the National Association of Manufacturers are putting out, you could look at the propaganda, you can look at the various things they do, and you can look at sort of broad trends in the discourse and moving towards being more free market or more pro-state action. But how have you thought about, in this book and your previous book, how do you find out whether the things they did were effective and how they were effective?
Well, one way is you see if a particular bit of propaganda, like the tripod of freedom, is being picked up and echoed elsewhere. But it's certainly difficult to prove cause and effect. And I give you an example. I spent a lot of time on trying to figure out the Christian capitalism angle when an organization called Spiritual Mobilization and some successor organizations tried to build a free market curriculum into the teachings of American seminaries, because they and a very wealthy oilman by the name of J. Howard Pugh, who is financing this effort, found through some polling the National Association of Manufacturers did that people tended to believe what they hear from their ministers and their pastors and their priests. And they thought, aha, here's the best vehicle we can use. So they wrote curriculum, they did outreach, and this is all in the late 40s and early 50s. Can I prove to you how many seminarians they converted? And the answer is, of course not. I can only tell you that there are sermons with free market ideals given, because we've seen some, but obviously they didn't convert every minister in the United States. They may not have converted a majority. My suspicion is they might have well done that, particularly because there's a major transformation in American religion going on. The old mainline Protestant churches were kind of collapsing in the late 40s and 50s with the rise of the evangelical and fundamentalist churches. And that's where this effort was most successful. But again, I can't chase it to individuals. I can't get to that level of cause and effect. So you're right to ask the question. And all I can say is that it was effective at some significant level. They kept doing it for decades. So they thought it was effective.
Right.
I think also what I can add to that, though, is, there's a famous quotation from William Whewell, who's the man who invented the word scientist. And he once said, "We only know causes by their effects." So in a way, we started with the effect, right? We saw in Merchants of Doubt the effect that market fundamentalist thinking had on the people we were studying and how it motivated them to resist the scientific evidence of the reality of climate change. And so then we wanted to go back and say, well, why would they think that? Especially because these were very smart, very educated people. Why would any intelligent person who knew anything about history believe these claims? And so we started working our way backward to show that there had been this big program to promote these claims over the course of an entire century. And so it is in some sense circumstantial, but the circumstances are pretty compelling.
Mm-hmm.
I think the place we show it most effectively is in our discussion of Ronald Reagan. Because one of the big questions of the book is, how do these views that are not mainstream before World War II and not even mainstream before the 1970s, how do they become mainstream? And how do they become so influential in American electoral politics? Because we know that they have been. I mean, that's clear.
Right.
And so one of the really interesting parts of the story, I think, is the tracking of Ronald Reagan, who in the 1940s is the president of the Screen Actors Guild. I don't think anyone would say that he was a great progressive, but he was a Democrat. He was pro-union. He was the president of a union. And he, as far as we can tell, was not particularly anti-government. I mean, he had been a New Deal Democrat. But by the late 1950s, early 60s, he has completely changed. He becomes the voice of the anti-union, anti-government right wing in America after the defeat of Barry Goldwater. So how does that happen? And we're able to show that in that intermediate period, he works for General Electric Corporation, where he adopts GE's anti-government, anti-union ideology and rhetoric and begins to hone it as he becomes a spokesman all across the United States for GE. And one other important thing, he leaves GE not just with a changed political ideology and a big public persona and a very well-practiced speech. He also leaves with powerful backers in corporate America who then finance his campaign for governor of California.
There's this famous quote from Keynes about how people who believe themselves to be exempt from intellectual influences are, he says, the slaves of some defunct economist. And I feel similarly about your books, both of them. What you do is you point out that when we have conversations about ideas, those ideas come from places. They come from people, they come from institutions. There are interest groups that push some ideas over others. So I guess I would ask you about the broader theory that runs through your work together about, how ideas are transmitted across society.
Well, that's kind of a rough question. Because society is itself kind of a big squishy mess of a thing, right?
Mm.
And I've always liked the line about the being a slave to a dead economist. But of course, the economists don't directly affect most people. Most people never meet them. Most people don't read their work. Instead, we get information from kind of a large body of a tapestry, really, of sources.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the reasons we structured the book in the somewhat odd way it is, we talk about, I told you the Christian capitalism story already about trying to embed free market messages into the clergy. There's newspapers that are more obvious. There's the think tank circuits that we kind of dealt with a little bit in Merchants of Doubt. So these ideas come from everywhere and they become kind of the information sea we swim in.
Mm.
And to me, as Naomi has said earlier, there's a saturation effect. And so the way ideas get transferred to us are through a myriad of different kinds of media. And that's what makes, or can make, a very small group of people very powerful if they're the ones who are able to set the messaging. And as I said at the beginning, it took these guys 30 years really to begin undoing to undo the New Deal ideas they're built into American society by the Roosevelt administration in the 30s. It wasn't fast. It took them a long time. It took them a lot of effort, but they eventually were able to resurrect not even ideas that were 19th century, but ideas that to some degree were new because, as we said earlier, Adam Smith was not the free marketeer that he's made out to be now.
Now, did they succeed because they find the right method, or do they succeed because their historical moment comes and they're able to take advantage of it?
Well, that's a great question. I think our answer to that, again, is probably a bit of both.
Yeah.
So there's no question that they are spending decades cultivating these arguments, developing their intellectual bona fides by funding academics at the University of Chicago and NYU, by putting the message into children's books and film and television, by cultivating Ronald Reagan and supporting his candidacy. And you have to credit them with a lot of patience and forbearance and persistence, right? I mean, they come out of the Great Depression and World War II really, as a kind of rejected ideology. My favorite quotation in the book is the one where Dwight Eisenhower says, if any party tried to get rid of Social Security, you'd never hear of that party again. And then he adds, there is a small splinter group who wants to do that. Their numbers negligible and they're stupid. So
we disagree with the stupid part. They weren't. That's what Dwight missed.
Right. But it's interesting that Eisenhower, who was by no means a stupid or unsophisticated person, saw them as stupid, right? And that's the late 50s. So now we go to, 76, 80, 1980, a couple of decades later, Ronald Reagan is elected president of the United States, arguing exactly that, right? And even today, we have Republicans trying to get rid of Social Security. So some of this is persistence, some of this is saturation, some of it is money. They spend huge amounts of money on these issues. And I think there's one other key thing that we mentioned and maybe is worth stressing. During this time, if you're asked yourself, well, what are progressives doing? What are liberals doing? I found a really interesting report that was written about this question in which they argued that at the same time, liberals are focusing mostly on specific issues. They're focusing on civil rights or women's rights or saving whales or preserving the tropical rainforest. And they're not really linking these arguments, mostly by and large, into a sort of bigger concept of society. Whereas the people we are studying are explicitly doing that. And again, here's a case where they say it in their own words, right? The section where we talk about Harold Lunow and Jasper Crane funding the Free Market Project at the University of Chicago explicitly with the idea of developing a blueprint for a free market economy and writing a book that will become the equivalent, what Mein Kampf did for the Nazis or what the Communist Manifesto did for communism. They want a capitalist manifesto, and they get it in the work of Milton Friedman and the book Capitalism and Freedom. So it's very conscious, it's very deliberate, and it's incredibly ambitious. It's big, it's a big idea, while their opponents are working on, I don't want to say little ideas, because I don't think saving whales is little, and I don't think civil rights is little, but a kind of more specified and siloed.
Right.
And so just to add one more thing, and then in the 1970s, when we really do have an economic crisis, they're standing ready with the answer to say it's because we have too much government.
Sure. So, yes, it's not that the issues are small, but it's that they don't come together under this big, overarching, all-explaining narrative that, capitalism and freedom says, well, capitalism will solve racial discrimination, it will solve environmental crises, it can do anything. This great, and to go back to where I started, to pay it tribute, it's this powerful story, kind of in the same way Marxism is. I feel like that's one of the sources of Marxism's power, and that the left, post being Marxist, doesn't have this kind of great, all-encompassing, inspiring, sort of quasi-religious story to tell.
Yeah, I think that's right. And so it's not a coincidence that we see Harold Lunow and Jasper Crane explicitly invoking the Communist Manifesto and saying, we need that book, but for the opposite argument.
one of the lessons I take from your book, and tell me if this is right or wrong, is seems like propaganda works.
Sometimes it works. The way kind of has to be prepared for it, right? It's like most other kinds of lies. The best ones have an element of truth to them. And yes, you can have a government that it fails, that becomes too powerful, and so on. We've seen this, throughout history, and we would like to avoid it. So one of the things that Naomi put into the book is that we think government solutions should be the smallest one that actually will be effective, and fair enough. But I think, and this is partially an answer to your earlier question of a few minutes ago, what I think ultimately gives them the opportunity to enact reforms is kind of the crisis of the late 70s. Right? We have a twin crisis of economics, the stagflation, and in foreign policy with the Arab oil embargoes that are, of course, tied into the stagflation, and then at the end of the Carter administration, the Iran hostage crisis. And so cause and effect again, I can't tell you what caused Carter to lose the election, because both those things weighed very heavily against him and he knew it. But that gives Reagan the opportunity to then enact. And who knows, if there had been no Iran crisis, maybe we would never have had Ronald Reagan as president. I don't know. But the point here is the ideas were available. When there was a crisis, they were able to take advantage of it. Mm-hmm. But they wouldn't have been able to without the ideas, without decades and decades of propagandizing them into the United States.
I have a slightly more pessimistic view. I think propaganda does work.
Oh, darn it, Naomi.
Well, the evidence in the book suggests it, I have to say.
I suggest that it does, yeah. And I'm not saying it doesn't work, but it also needs an opportunity, right?
Right. I know. I'm not disagreeing really. I just
yeah, right. Today I see, right-wing propaganda outlets like PragerU, which gets tens of millions of dollars every year, and they do like children's television now. They do children's books. And I think to myself, does this work? Is this effective? Do they know it works? Or are they just trying everything? But it does seem as if their strategy, PragerU does these 5-minute videos where they explain any issue from the right-wing perspective. And my impression, and again, looking at the sort of victories that have been won over the course of the last century that you document, is that this is not a bad idea for how to operate.
Well, it is a bad idea because...
Like morally, yes.
I know, right. Yeah. Well, I mean, it is a tricky question because sometimes people will ask us, so are we saying that the left wing should do what the right wing does? And no, we're not. We're not defending propaganda, and we're certainly not defending lies and disinformation. But I think we are saying people have to be more aware of this as an issue and think through, how do you respond to propaganda? Because, Eric and I came across this a lot when we were writing Merchants of Doubt. The climate change disinformation campaign was heavily based on the claim that the science was unsettled and that there was still a big debate. And this is extremely clever because if we come along and say, no, there's no debate, and they say, yes, there is a debate, guess what? There's your debate, and they've won. And so you can't just debate the people who are saying there's a debate. You have to find a different way of responding to it. And I think that's part of the argument, the lesson of our work that I think Eric and I would like to make people think about. How do you respond to propaganda? Because you don't fix it by simply countering one set of lies with a different set of lies.
Yes, obviously, I don't think we need left-wing propaganda, but I do think we need to think. I mean, one of the reasons I'm in media, I run a small magazine, and, we do all this debunking of right-wing arguments, is because I think you've got to find some way to counter the messaging, because it really does seem pretty effective.
Yeah, unfortunately so.
I want to ask you, Reason magazine reviewed your book, and they were very upset. Reason, libertarian magazine, they're really unhappy, and one of the reasons they're unhappy, essentially, that the argument of your book is what they call a conspiracy theory, because it posits that some small group of people got together to manipulate the public, or small groups of people in secret. How do you respond to the charge of positing a conspiratorial view of history?
Well, it's not a small group. And I would argue that it can't be much of a conspiracy, because not only was much of what they did in public, they left their bloody papers in archives where we could find them. They weren't burning the evidence, right? What they were doing they thought was completely above board. And frankly, I think it was. It all seemed perfectly legal to me. So I'd reject the conspiracy idea outright. We're showing you how people organize themselves to change the way Americans thought about their country and their government. And there's nothing conspiratorial about it when you can show what they did and how they did it from their own papers. That's not conspiracy. That's the way history has always been done.
Yeah, that's a really great answer. I like that. The only thing I would add to it is that sometimes there actually are conspiracies. I mean, this is a common criticism we get all the time, to try to discredit us as conspiracy theorists. So obviously, as Erik just said, when you write history and you show what people have actually done, that's history. But sometimes history does, in fact, involve conspiracies. And we showed that in Merchants of Doubt. Well, we didn't show it, but many scholars and lawyers have shown that the tobacco industry did, in fact, engage in a conspiracy. And they were prosecuted by the U.S. Department of Justice. So it is important for people to recognize that there are conspiracies and there are corporate conspiracies. And history shows that they can be very, very serious and damaging. So we're not alleging an illegal conspiracy here. But, if lawyers want to look at this because they think maybe laws have been broken, that's a different question. And we don't address that question in this book.
Yeah, but of course, if a corporation follows Milton Friedman's dictum that their social responsibility is solely to maximize their profits, kind of follows from that their job, if you're a fossil fuel company, for instance, is to try and cast doubt on the science so that nobody does anything that's going to limit your future profits.
Right, one could conclude that.
Would you agree with or disagree with the opening of Edward Bernays' Propaganda, where he says, the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society? Obviously, he says it's good, but he says, those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. Do you think he overstates the case, or that's about right?
No, I think that's about right. And I think that's why it's so terrifying.
Yep, I think that's about right. And the counter to that was, well, if you want to make sure that that's not so totalitarian, you want to ensure that the media is composed of many voices. So it's not so easy to coordinate messages, right? And so one thing you would not want is a complete concentration of media in a small number of hands.
Right.
Which is why our chapter on the deregulation of telecommunications is so important, right? Because part of the reason these people are able to be so effective at manipulation is because they're able to control, or at least heavily influence, so many channels of communication. And this also, I think, relates to a question we don't take on in the book, but we did briefly talk about in Merchants of Doubt, which is the issue of free speech. In an ideal, perfect democratic society, in a sort of Platonic republic, we'd have an open public square and all voices could be heard. But the problem with that sort of idealized Athenian model is that you have, first of all, speech is very expensive, access to media is very expensive, and you have very disproportionate access to media by certain sectors of the United States and completely other groups that are almost entirely silenced. And so how do you reconcile the ideals of free speech with the realities of this extremely disproportionate distribution of opportunities to speak? And this is, again, where Milton Friedman, it's so disgraceful, his arguments, and you really wonder if anyone has actually read Capitalism and Freedom, how they could defend it. Because one of the things he does in that book is defend the idea that rich people should be able to buy speech, right? He has an explicit discussion that we talk about in the book, that one of the great things about capitalism is that rich people can hire other people to promote their ideas, and therefore they can be heard. Well, that would be great if poor people had the same equal opportunity, but they don't.
Yeah, it frustrates me so much when I see, how much PragerU spends every year, and I work for this tiny underfunded leftist magazine. You're like, how on earth can we compete? Because the economic disparity becomes a speech disparity.
Correct.
Yep.
Right.
Well, one of the ways that people can fight the influence of moneyed speech is to understand where the information that they get comes from, how they are being influenced without their conscious knowledge. And in order to discover the truth, they should read the history, and they should read the history that is collected in the books Merchants of Doubt and The Big Myth, both by Naomi Oreskes and Erik M. Conway. Thank you both for joining us today on Current Affairs.
Thanks for having you. It's been fun.
Thank you. It's been great.
The Current Affairs Podcast is a product of Current Affairs Magazine. If you are not subscribed to Current Affairs Magazine, visit currentaffairs.org/subscribe today and get our glorious print edition. The Current Affairs Podcast is released regularly every week on patreon.com/currentaffairs. Thanks for listening.